In the previous session, we met Epictetus. Lucian of Samosata called him that marvelous old man. He was a philosopher who was a slave. He was physically disabled. He spent his life in exile. He spent his entire time as a philosopher teaching young students in a classroom. And yet he spoke words of fiery freedom and of awesome responsibility to these young students of philosophy. And in speaking to them, provided an image and an ideal of what philosophy might be like to many readers following those first hearers of him. In the last session, we focused upon the style of the diatribe as a means of teaching and on his portrayal of the ideal cynic. It's very unlikely that Epictetus thought of himself as fulfilling that ideal or expected his students to be the sort of cynic that he portrayed. But he presented an ideal as a standard by which all those who pursue the philosophical life might measure themselves. An understanding of philosophy as being something more than theory, but a transformation of life, and a transformation of life that was not simply for one's own benefit, but for the benefit of humanity. I want to focus in this session on Epictetus's remarkably narrow perception of the Stoic path to virtue. Epictetus has an exceptionally narrow focus with a brilliant variety of styles of exhorting to that way of life. It wasn't as though he was unlearned or incapable of mastering the intricacies of philosophical argument. He clearly had the capacity to discourse learnedly on the technical aspects of Stoic philosophy, as, for example, were found in the writings of Chrysippus. But his interest is in the moral transformation of his students, and his problem is that his students are all too willing to be distracted by theory, because theory is so much easier than practice. To keep his students' attention, therefore, on the essential task of practicing virtue and growing in moral character, Epictetus often appears to us as something like a coach or a trainer who has a set of simple lessons to teach, but his challenge is to provide them in such a glittering variety of ways as to keep his students always interested and always challenged to keep performing those simple exercises. We see first that he was intensely loyal to the Stoic tradition that he had learned from Musonius Rufus. There is no sense in which Epictetus could be called eclectic in the way that Cicero or even Seneca or Dio Chrysostom was eclectic. Epictetus was thoroughly Stoic through and through, and he is outspoken in his criticism of rival philosophical schools. Discourse 220, for example, is totally devoted to an attack against the Epicureans and the academics. He begins by saying that the propositions which are true and evident must necessarily be employed even by those who contradict them. And he says, in fact, this may be one of the best proofs of the truth of a proposition, that the people who deny its truth have to use it in order to deny it. So that, he says, if a man should contradict the proposition that there is a universal statement which is true, it is clear that he must assert the contrary and say, no universal statement is true. Slave, this isn't true either. For what does this assertion amount to then? If a statement is universal, it is false. Now, as an example of that sort of self-contradiction, he takes Epicurus, who wishes to do away with the natural fellowship of people with each other. And he quotes Epicurus to the effect that there is no fellowship with one another among rational beings. But then Epictetus very easily notes that he acts in a way contradictory to that premise. He asks, what was it then that roused Epicurus from his slumbers and compelled him to write what he did? What else but the strongest thing in men, nature, which draws a man to do her will, though he groans and is reluctant? For, nature tells Epicurus, since you hold these anti-social opinions, write them down and bequeath them to others, and give up your sleep because of them, and become in fact yourself the advocate to denounce your own doctrines. In other words, if Epictetus wrote his philosophy of antisocial behavior down, he must have done it because he's a social creature. Thus, his own behavior contradicts the premise that he takes up. Epictetus attacks the academics. You will remember that the academics were the members of the Platonic school, which at this time was very much given to skepticism, especially those followers of Pyrrho, who denied that real knowledge was possible. So he engages in an imaginary conversation with one of these Platonists. Do your senses tell you that you are awake? No, he answers, any more than they do when in my dreams I have the impression that I am awake. Is there then no difference between these two impressions? None, quoth he. Can I argue with this man any longer? And what cautery or lancet shall I apply to him to make him realize that he is deadened? He does realize it, but pretends that he does not. He is even worse than a corpse. One man does not notice the contradiction. He is in a bad way. Another man notices it indeed, but is not moved, does not improve. He is in a still worse state. And so he says, if a follower of Plato or of Pyrrho come to me and say that they can't know anything because of the unreliability of sense impressions, what shall I say? If it's a theoretical question, he says, of how does perception arise, whether it's through the whole body or whether it's through some particular part, perhaps I do not know how to give a reasonable answer. And both views perplex me. So at the theoretical level, the academicians have a strong argument. If you analyze words, you really can't necessarily know what exactly is going on. But that you and I are not the same persons, I know very certainly. Whence do I know this? When I want to swallow something, I never take the morsel to that place, but to this place. When I wish to take bread, I never take up sweepings, but I move to the bread exactly as to a mark. And do you yourselves, who take away the evidence of the senses, do anything else? Does any one of you, when he wants to go to a bath, go to a mill instead? Ought we not, to the best of our ability, then, hold fast and maintain the commonly received opinions, and be on our guard against the arguments that seek to overthrow them? Epictetus's worry with the academics is that they can lead his students, who are young and impressionable, to think that philosophy is just about asking questions like, when is, or it depends on what you mean by is. These kinds of word games. I greatly fear, he says, that a noble-spirited young man may hear these statements and be influenced by them, or having been influenced already, may lose all the germs of the nobility which he possessed, that we may be giving an adulterer grounds for brazening out his acts, or that some embezzler of public funds may lay hold of a specious plea based upon these theories, that someone who neglects his own parents may gain additional effrontery from them. His worry, in other words, is that those who think of philosophy as a word game and are used to people arguing in this fashion may grow morally confused and fail to recognize that there is real behavior that is either good or bad underlying these things, and focus upon the fact that people can make clever arguments. You can make adultery disappear, in other words, by arguing the definition of adultery. You can make fraud disappear, as we can see around us today, by arguing the meaning of fraud. Epicurus is dangerous for another reason. Epicurus is very clear in his principles. He is what would be called a dogmatic philosopher. And so he lays down his principles very clearly. But Epictetus finds him dangerous because his doctrines are fundamentally destructive. For example, his antisocial attitude that we ought not to have